This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is unidentified flying objects or UFOs. I have two experts on this, and this conversation will begin in a moment. David Halperin and Eric Willett are my guests. They are people who have written about the subject of unidentified flying objects or UFOs before, and I want to give them both a chance to give a couple of minutes of background about themselves, things that they have written, why they have an interest in this field, and so forth. So let me turn to the left. David Halperin. He's been a UFO investigator for decades. David, if I can you give me a little bit of background, a biography about yourself, both pre and post your interest in UFOs?
Okay, well, I don't know that we could do too much pre-interest because I became interested in UFOs when I was 12 going on 13. And that was the beginning of my ufologist career, which came to an end when I was 17 and went off to college, whereupon I began to pursue more conventionally acceptable studies, like Semitic languages and later on history of Judaism, which I wound up teaching at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Now, my special fields of interest were religious traditions of heavenly ascent and otherworldly journeys, which even while I was doing them, I realized was still UFOs, just in a more respectable, sublimated form. Mm-hmm. And about 25 years ago, I turned around and started asking, what did UFOs mean to me as a teenager? And from that, what do UFOs mean to the enormous number of people who are in one way or another emotionally engaged with them, including vigorous disbelief? And this seems to me the essential question about UFOs, not where do they come from or what makes them fly, but what do they mean?
Well, let me ask you this, because you said that you had a career in academia, and a lot of famous people who've written, or people who are famous who've written books about UFOs that have become bestsellers or well-known, people like a John Mack, have also had careers in academia. Do your colleagues, when if they know about it or find out, do they say, "Oh, there goes Crazy Dave again"?
Well, I'm retired now, so. And I've done most of my UFO work since retiring, so I've not had too much of a chance to get feedback from the people I talk with at UNC Chapel Hill. But I do have some very fine colleagues in academia, one of whom is on the right side of the screen, another of whom is Jeff Kripow, who has published a number of, he's a professor of religious studies at Rice University, who's published a number of excellent books which draw UFOs into the wider context of religious studies scholarship. Diana Pasulka, a professor of philosophy and religion at UNC Wilmington, who is doing very similar researches. Steve Finley at I think it's at Louisiana State University, who has done some excellent work on UFOs in the African American tradition, which is a very ill-studied and I think extremely important area. So these are the people I would now call my colleagues, and we work together.
Well, before I turn to Eric, let me just finally ask you, would you say that your interest then in unidentified flying objects is more from a cultural, social perspective than from a nuts and bolts, faster than light science perspective?
Yeah, I don't think they exist as nuts and bolts, faster than light.
Okay.
But I believe they do exist as something from within us
Okay.
that have as and I'll expose myself, come out of the closet right now that I am a Freudian and still more a Jungian.
Uh-huh.
I believe UFOs are a myth in the Jungian sense,
Uh-huh.
which means the most profoundly true things and real things there are.
And we'll get to that later on. Let me turn to Eric now. Eric, if I can ask you to give a little background about yourself, as David did, any books you've written, that kind of thing, and how you got interested in the subject.
All right. My interest in UFOs started, I was around 7, 8 years old. A family event in my house. We had the observation of a UFO, had older brothers. They were owning the binoculars. I couldn't see them. I was bugging them, etc. Eventually, I was able to take the binoculars, but I couldn't see anything. So I became witness to a UFO witnessing event. So it was a very different perspective. That remained latent for quite a while. We go back to the late 1990s. I had a friend when I was doing my PhD who was very much interested in UFO stuff. And I started to read and get reacquainted with the whole thing. And it became very, very distinctive when I was reading. For those who know a little bit about UFOs, there was days of Roswell and completely wild conspiracy theory stuff and a lot of nonsense. So I decided, you know what, it's just something that is still a mystery. We don't have a definite explanations for the most difficult cases. Why don't I not think this as a regular academic project? So I do review the literature, who wrote about that, what are the main ideas there. And eventually I started to write a blog in 2005, and which eventually led to writing a book. I was published in 2015. And my approach is in a way similar to David and yet different. I'm a sociologist by training, so I did my PhD in sociology. And I'm looking into how parapsychological events or elements, what parapsychologists call psi, gets involved in the mix of the UFO event. What I'm doing right now, I may surprise some of your viewers, but I'm a professor at the Royal Military College of Canada, so think about West Point if you want, but again, version. And I'm teaching, but I have been our work teaching to our senior officers. So I'm very much involved with the military, and yet I don't see any conspiracy, any of that. And I mean, been working there for many years now. I understand military way of thinking, how they see the world, and all conspiracies, they really don't impress me. I cannot see the military mindset doing these kind of things that way.
Yeah, and one of the things that I've always found bizarre about the whole military Area 51 kind of thing is, if it's been 70 years now, basically, from 1947 when the Roswell thing and Kenneth Arnold, the modern UFO phenomenon started, well, why the hell haven't we adapted this technology by reverse engineering it? I mean, it can't be that hermetically intellectual. We should have things far beyond just Facebook by now, no?
Absolutely, and I mean, think about it. A research project that would last 70 years and nothing to show for. They would have got funding long time before that. Right. It doesn't make any sense.
And we would have technology that could blow ISIS out of the water. If these are people or creatures that can come from across light years distance, we'd be able to zap them easily. There'd be no, I mean, whoever had that technology would basically become the dominant power on the planet by a mile.
Absolutely. Those conspiracy theories are speaking more about how we collectively fantasize than actual reality.
Okay, well, let me start off, and I want to give a broad overview. I was born in 1965, so I came of age in the 1970s. I remember still going to movie theaters for example, and seeing Eric von Daniken's films about ancient astronauts, Chariots of the Gods, and the 70s had The Age of Aquarius and Jonathan Livingston Seagull, and it had the Gimlin-Patterson Bigfoot film. It had Alan Watts, the Bermuda Triangle was big. You had all these sorts of things. The Betty and Barney Hill had that famous television movie with James Earl Jones that was on. Roswell first came into view, and it seemed that the 1970s was just right for that. In Search Of, Leonard Nimoy had that TV show where he looked into Bigfoot and UFOs and whatnot. Do you, taking from a cultural perspective, do you think that that's really when, say, the Vietnam Watergate era was when UFOs really took hold? Because yes, we know about Kenneth Arnold, the Roswell stuff, and supposedly ancient astronauts in the Mayans and the Egyptians and whatnot. But do you really think the late 60s, early 70s is when the modern idea of UFOs took hold? Let me start with you, David.
I don't think so.
No?
It's an extremely good question. And I'll answer the question with an unanswerable question, okay? Which is, we nowadays we think of the UFO era as beginning with Kenneth Arnold and with Roswell.
Yeah. What
we forget now is that for 30 years, no one ever heard of Roswell.
Yeah.
Between that it created a very brief bubble of media excitement a day or two after the famous announcement that a lead disc had been recovered, and then was totally forgotten until October 1978, when people began to come forward with memories of what they remembered or thought they remembered from 30 years earlier.
And wasn't it Charles Berlitz who had the book? The first book was Charles Berlitz, right?
Yeah, Berlitz and Moore, the Roswell incident, 1980.
Okay.
And yet it was not until the 90s, it seems to me, or perhaps the late 80s, that Roswell became a household word. Mm-hmm. I don't know how you measure these things. One way is to read comics. That when comic strips refer, as they did frequently in the 90s, to Roswell and taken for granted that the reader knows the allusion, then we know that this is something that is embedded in the culture. Mm-hmm. Who today would ask what Roswell is? You might just as well ask who these children in the gingerbread house were. Mm-hmm. Everybody knows. And to define this, even the what, is an immensely difficult question. Far less the why. So I do not have the answer. To get back to your original question, I do not share your impression that the 70s were a particularly seminal time. Probably more, if we had to pick one, the late 80s and the 90s. But I do not know.
Okay. How about you, Eric? What is your thought about when the modern era of UFO consciousness began?
Well, I would say that since the early days, in the 50s, there was already conspiracy theories about government hiding things. Major Keel wrote extensively about that, made comments of that nature. There's a book of Man in Black written in those days. So
this was the era of the contactees, when blonde Venusians were, before the gray bug-eyed alien. We had blonde Venusians. We had all these films about, UFOs coming to save the Earth from nuclear destruction, basically. Klaatu Nixicto Barato, whatever it was.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And then if you read the 1960s literature, the Lorenzans, for instance, they are talking about government knowing an invasion coming, and they're not holding all those things. So this narrative always been there. And I agree with David that the 70s probably did not changed much. Maybe there was less confidence in institutions because of Watergate, Vietnam, and so on. But it's not I don't think it was a major trigger. What happened, I think, in the 1980s, within UFO study circles or ufology, the Roswell story started to pick up steam, but it was still in a small world of ufologists. And I really think that it came out in the bigger popular culture because of the show X-Files. It was an immensely popular show watched by millions. And that story of Roswell was kind of in the backdrop of many of the elements of that show. And then, of course, there was the ufologists. Some of them became a little bit more famous. There's documentaries, and then it started to have a snowball effect. But I personally think that the X-Files, the show, was probably the most important trigger of all this in the 1990s. Well, and the end of the show also kind of brought a decline of ufology, and I think there's a correlation we can establish between the two.
Well, let me step back. So I did mention Eric von Däniken, and although he's clearly someone who's not taken seriously even by hardcore ufologists, he does. The one aspect I would say goes to this Freudian Jungian thing. I mean, yes, if you look at his claims about the Nazca lines and whatnot being an airport, it's ridiculous. But is there any truth to the idea that human beings, for back to the Egyptians or whatnot, were seeing lights in the sky? Because you can look at paintings from the 12th or 13th century, and there are comets with look like little homunculi inside of them, and people say, see, this was UFOs, not comets or whatnot. Like they can't tell that people could be metaphoric or something. Let me start with you, David. Is there anything to the things like the Aurora crash in 1897 Texas, supposedly, or the 1897 the airship craze and stuff pre-Ken Arnold?
Yeah, there's something to it, but I don't know what that something is. I mean, we're dealing with the 1897 airship sightings are very remarkable in that they attest, insofar as they're genuine, because a lot of them seem to have been newspaper hoaxes.
Yeah.
But that insofar as they're genuine, they seem to attest to people experiencing things in the sky that are just a step ahead of where people were at the time technologically. People, including a Louisiana rabbi who was visiting Texas, and how a rabbi was involved with this is, to me, a very interesting puzzle. But that he claimed to have actually met the pilots of the airship, who are not intergalactic travelers. In 1897, the pilots of the airship were American inventors who had a strange tendency to be named Wilson.
Yeah.
And this rabbi came out to and I think this was reported in a Louisiana newspaper, came out to a rural country house where he saw the landed airship, met and shook hands with the pilots.
Yeah, well, David, let me just ask you though something though, because how reliable are those reports? And I say this because back in like the early mid '80s, I started reading a lot of these books about unexplained phenomena, even beyond UFOs. There's a famous story, for example, about the supposed footprints of the devil in a snowstorm in the 1700s running across rooftops in New England. There's a story about a person named David Gray somewhere in the Midwest who just disappeared in front of people's eyes. There are stories about children supposedly speaking in tongues the moment they're born or remembering past lives. And yet, when people have investigated this, they can find no evidence of this person living in that county there. So this rabbi, is there note of this rabbi being from a Louisiana parish and whatnot? Is there something there?
Yeah, Jerome Clark, who was the editor and really almost the exclusive author of a masterwork called the UFO Encyclopedia, which anyone who is interested in UFOs needs to have on his or her shelf. That Clark did investigate this and found that the rabbi certainly existed. He was trained in Europe and came out. And I think actually, I think I misstated. I think although he was reported in a Louisiana newspaper, I think he was in Texas.
Okay.
So that there's no question he's an historical character. Now, that he met the pilots of this airship is impossible. It's impossible.
Uh-huh.
If he said he met bug-eyed grays from another galaxy, I would not say it's impossible. But that he met American inventors who had created an airship a decade or two before the Wright brothers, and then vanished from the pages of history. That is absolutely impossible. So what did this man experience? What did it mean to him? And how did this story originate?
Well, this was the era of the H.G. Wells, Nemo, 20,000 Leagues. So there was this sort of what was now called steampunk idea of people being able to do wild and crazy things. So could that have been part of it too? Or maybe he just was, with a wink and a nod telling us that. I mean, do we have, for example, an interview with him with, say, the Dallas Morning News or something?
I don't recall what the Louisiana newspaper said about him, and I don't know why it should appear in a Louisiana newspaper.
Okay.
But I can tell you my personal guess that as a Jew in late 19th century Texas, and as an immigrant from Europe, he was twice an alien. By shaking hands with the airship inventors, he became part of what you refer to, the late 19th century American story of invention. And I think that was how it functioned for him. Now, if we could bring him back via Ouija board or whatever, and say, why did you tell that story? What was the reality underlying it? I don't have the slightest idea how he'd answer. And this, to me, is the real UFO mystery. Not what are the aliens and what are they doing here? There aren't any aliens, or at least not in our skies.
Eric, what's your take on the pre-Ken Arnold stories, whether we're talking 1897 here in America or going back, supposedly to pre-Columbian America, Egypt, or China?
Well, there's a very good book written by Jacques Vallée and Chris Aubeck. They do a survey, a very, very well-documented survey of UFO sightings before 1880. Anyone interested in that topic or that aspect should read that book. We have to understand that this is very descriptive, that and usually it's very ancient documents in some cases where we have description of people seeing strange things in the sky. End of story. We don't know it's. We have no explanation. But if you want at least that data, that's a good source. And he published a newer edition with very nice reproduction of paintings and stuff. So, but those are really interesting. I suggest you should probably get that the newer version of his work. We'll go back to the airship wave. One thing that we need to keep in mind: the very first observation, the witnesses were in San Francisco, and they saw strange lights in the sky. The journalists who got the story actually changed that to airships, because it doesn't make sense to have strange lights in the sky when you are in 1897. But airships, where it's something you can imagine that was coming in terms of technology, it's just a matter of time. Like us right now, we're thinking about being on Mars. In a couple of decades, we have on Mars thing. And then later on, like as weeks and months passes, then people start to see airships and gives detailed description of airships. It's an interesting phenomenon here that the stories seem to take shapes based on how we other people describe them. And I'm not saying people are lying. I'm just saying that somehow what we think may have some sort of presentation outside based on how we think. And so whatever the phenomena is, whatever is behind it, we as humans have a lot to do with how it's actually shaped and reported.
Well, let me ask a general question, and again, I'll start with David. America is a country that's different from other countries from its founding in that, unlike Australia, we weren't a bunch of convicts, but we were sort of the dregs of society that other countries didn't want. And in order for Americans to succeed, we got this sort of obsession with money and status and whatnot. And that seems to have permeated so much of culture, from yellow journalism of the 19th century to this Hollywood ethos of bigger, badder, better. Donald Trump, for example, is a perfect shining example of that Barnum and Bailey kind of self-promotion. Do you think that the UFO phenomenon, what we call it worldwide, is chiefly a product of America, i.e. that if the Ken Arnold incident, if it really happened, had occurred, say, in Australia, like there have been some famous cases in Australia or New Zealand, a flyer who went missing sometime in the 1950s. But if that had been the first case in New Zealand, would UFOs have become what they became? Like I mentioned, the 1950s Hollywood films of the contactee era. So do you think that UFOs worldwide are driven by this American ethos of bigger, badder self-promotion? Let me start with you, David.
I don't think that's the explanation. I don't think it's a matter of bigger, better self-promotion. I think you raise a very interesting question, which is to what extent are UFOs culturally determined? Is there significance that, although they are now a worldwide phenomenon, they began in America? And if so, what is that significance? I do not know, but I will answer with a tangent, and that is, I visited Israel for the first time in 1964, and I was then 16 years old, and that was the height of my ufologist career, and I was all eager to find out what the UFO scene was in Israel. And the answer was that there was none. The word for UFO didn't even exist in Hebrew. You had to call them flying saucers, which sounds a great deal more ridiculous in Hebrew than it does in English. Somehow or other, by the 1990s, Israelis had begun seeing UFOs. In the 60s, they did. In the 90s, they did. What changed and how did it change? There is a new book on the subject by an Israeli anthropologist, which I have to admit to you I have not read. It's on my shelf and it's on my to-read list, but I haven't gotten to it yet, that explores that question. And I think it's a crucial question. Is it connected with the fact that Israel in the 1960s was essentially a third world country, and in the 90s, a first world country? Are UFOs a phenomenon of the developed world? I'm tempted to say yes, but immediately South America comes to contradict me.
Yeah.
That as far back as the 1950s, there were striking reports from Venezuela, from Brazil, including the infamous Antonio Diaz case.
Yeah.
With that, so that apparently it's not just the major industrial nations, Europe, Japan, that have UFOs. So what explains this? I don't know.
How about you, Eric? What are your thoughts about UFOs and its start basically in America?
Well, my take on that is that the United States, if you go back to the mid-1940s, had probably a form of journalism that was maybe more open in terms of variations compared to Europe, where the standards of journalism were a little bit more tight. So maybe that allowed that to come out. I'm speculating here, but there might be some changes at that level. What I noticed, though, is not so much the nature of the UFO experience will vary from country to country a little bit, especially when you have encounters with other entities. The nature of that encounter, the way it's described, the way the other entities is behaving, is clearly linked to the culture of the people who are reporting. So for me, there's a clear link there. But further much, I think it's the reaction of the authorities that is quite different. And because in France, for instance, they had the major UFO wave in 1954, and it was not the big conspiracy. The government did the study. It was wondering what was going on, but it never evolved into one of those big plot of the government to try to hide things. They actually eventually transferred all the files to a government-funded agency working with academics in the civilian world. So that's a very different reaction. But that's the society, the type of government you have that will react that way or the other way. So I don't think there's anything. There's some aspects of ufology and UFO experience that are specific to the United States, but I don't think this is something, the entire UFO event is American per se.
Well, let me talk about sort of the shift. Initially, say in the modern era, from the Ken Arnold, for the first few years, there were these sightings. Then we got what was called the contactee era, and most ufologists dismiss these as basically people who went on to aggrandize themselves, supposedly going to Venus and seeing, a lush paradise or whatnot. And then we have some of these stranger reports that come up, like the Vias Boas case, which was a guy who supposedly had sex with an alien that barked at him like a dog. And then, I guess, 1964, we have the Betty and Barney Hill case that didn't become public until 3 or 4 years later in the late 60s. There seemed to be a whole menagerie of UFO types, Nordic aliens. There was sometimes things like the Flatwoods Monster is supposedly considered an alien. Some people have tried to link Bigfoot sightings with alien sightings in the 50s. What do you think changed from that early initial stage of this whole menagerie of kinds of aliens being seen until we get to the Betty Barney Hill and the gray aliens abduction things? And did abductionism, do you think the idea of abductees, has that taken away from ufology, or has it added to it as a study? Let me start with Eric this time.
That's a very good question. It's a complex one as well. One thing that we need to underline is that after the story of Betty and Barney Hill was made into a TV movie that was shown in the early 70s, that's after that we had an explosion of cases of abductions, which eventually became known in the 80s because some serious researchers looked into it. So there's clearly a cultural element to it we cannot ignore. I wrote in a little bit about this notion that it's interesting to notice that abduction phenomena is closely related to reproduction, especially female reproductive capacity. Yeah. And it's also strange enough the time where feminism becomes very strong, and this notion that women should have the control of their own reproductive capacity, having kids whenever they want, rather than letting the husband or the boyfriend decide. And that UFO story is a little bit the same story. It's just repeated with different characters in that story. So I think there's also another cultural element with that shifted things towards a more, say, feminist interest, or by projection, feminist in nature. So it's a very different take at it, but I think changes in society have provoked changes in the experience of UFO and leading to the abduction. In the abduction world, you have a lot of people who have been traumatized, whatever is the source of the trauma. And in many of those cases, there's no UFO. They think they've been on a ship. They think they're aliens. But there's no strange things in the sky. And that makes those cases much more difficult to study. And in my personal opinion, it deserves a separate study because it almost very, very few cases you can link it with observations in the sky, which makes it thinking that it's a different phenomena altogether.
Mhm.
But again, other people have different opinions on that.
How about you, David? What is your thoughts about the pre and post Barney Hill, Betty and Barney Hill ideas of abductionism? Has abductionism detracted or added to the UFO lore?
Oh, it's certainly added. There's no question at all. I mean, it's a whole new dimension of it. Now, I don't think Betty and Barney Hill were taken aboard a flying saucer.
Mhm.
I think that a fellow named Jim McDonald took the same drive that Betty and Barney Hill did, and he saw the same light they described. It turned out to be a light on a watchtower, a very powerful electric light on a watchtower on one of the mountains, which, as McDonald writes, that even if you know what it is a very eerie sight. And given that Betty and Barney Hill were both exhausted, they had been traveling, they apparently could not afford to stay a last hotel, that it makes excellent sense that they would have been baffled by it. Now, why that light triggered the memories that it did, which were so powerful, that when Barney took them in the psychiatrist's office, covered them under hypnosis in the psychiatrist's office, he became so excited and frightened that the psychiatrist thought he was going to throw himself out the window. Why? What happened there? I don't know. Now we got. Sorry.
No. Well, David, let me just ask you this though. The Hill case. There's a fellow, and I don't remember his name. I tried to get him for this show, who's written a blog, and he's a fairly well known in the UFO community. I can't remember his name. Who posited that in the month before the Betty and Barney Hill case, there were 3 episodes of The Outer Limits with aliens that really resembled what Barney Hill described. And getting back to the Hollywood thing, this was, of course, the era of just 3 networks when you had, 25, 30% of the people watching television on one of the 3 networks every night. Are you familiar with the claims about the Outer Limits television show and its propensity for using aliens and monsters and whatnot, and that Barney Hill was a fan of that show supposedly?
No. Okay. The person you're speaking of is Martin Kottmeyer.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and I'm sorry he's not here with us because he's a genius. Okay, he's with the most stunning knowledge. I have never asked any question about UFOs that he couldn't come up with an informed answer. Now, I thought his argument about the Outer Limits was absolutely convincing, even though apparently Barney Hill did not watch the show.
Oh, okay.
That doesn't bother me. That things are in the air.
Yeah.
Well, he worked in a post office. He could have heard people discussing it. But Kottmeyer never tried to say that was the explanation for the whole experience. It was just the source of one detail of the experience. And I think he's absolutely he's absolutely right and absolutely convincing. But the raw terror that Barney experienced. Now, I will tell you my own speculation that it goes back much farther. That if I ask, how did Barney Hill's ancestors get to this country?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a pretty fair guess that they were abducted in the middle of the night and carried off to an alien ship.
And do we know, for example, that he grew up in the South? Did he maybe see Klansmen riding in the night? I don't know.
I don't know either whether he'd seen them. He may or may not have, but certainly he knew about it. He and his wife. You know, of course, that it was an interracial marriage. That Betty was white. They were both deeply involved in the civil rights movement. They were faithful members of their Unitarian Church, which was presumably the only place that would really accept, even in New England, that would really accept an interracial couple. Hardly more than 6 years before they took the trip that resulted in their abduction, Emmett Till was lynched in Mississippi for supposedly having made suggestive remarks to a white woman. I think that all sorts of, okay, and now I'm going to get really Jungian here, all sorts of collective memories,
Yeah.
perhaps transmitted genetically, perhaps transmitted in sort of code language from generation to generation, as has been documented with Holocaust survivors and their children, that their experiences are transmitted non-verbally, that these things came down to Barney. He experienced them, that light on the hill triggered them. They came forth. Then, for years, they remained dormant. And then in the 1980s, came to strange blooms when all sorts of people, normally not African American, almost invariably not African American, began to re-experience the experience that the hills had injected into our cultural bloodstream.
And David, it should be stated too that I think the hills, not only in UFO lore, but they are a good early example of what might be called false memory syndrome. We know, like the satanic cults that supposedly were abusing children in daycare centers in the 1980s, infamously on Geraldo Rivera's show. We have the last 20 or 30 years, women have put men behind bars with false rape accusations that via DNA we know they couldn't have committed. So we know that nowadays that people can make up and do make up memories unconsciously, perhaps. So do you think that the hills are also sort of a precursor of this sort of it's not my fault kind of idea that we have in society now, that everything is we're not responsible for things?
Well, I don't quite believe in false memory syndrome.
No.
Which doesn't mean that I believe that whatever we think we remember happened as we remember it. In fact, it seems to me that the transformation of memory is vital to UFOs. But to dismiss it as false memory syndrome seems to me mistaken. I think we're looking at a genuine memory or a genuine something from within us that needs, as Freud said, that it requires reinterpretation, which is for me the case with Betty and Barney Hill. Indeed, and it's, by the way, the case with tons of huge numbers of other UFO cases. I think Roswell is an issue of people remembering things that didn't happen as they remembered them, but that happened in some other, often very different way. I don't know if I wanted to add one other thing here, and this is you started out asking about the types of creatures that are seen on the UFOs, and we need to realize that Betty and Barney Hill did not see what we now think of as the classic grays.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, they seem to have transformed what they saw in the course of their hypnotic regressions. That initially, the people who had abducted them, the beings that had abducted them, looked like pretty much ordinary human beings. Barney Hill's first recollection of what he saw looking through the window of the UFO was a red-headed Irishman. Now, what on earth would a red-headed Irishman be doing on a UFO? And Barney answers that question. Irish people tend not to like Negroes. So that whenever I find an Irish person who is friendly, I will try my best to be friendly to that person. And this is a man who has just been traveling through lily white Canada with his white wife, wondering each night, will they be willing to let us stay at the motel? Then what he sees is that the red-headed Irishman is gone, and he sees a Nazi in a black leather jacket. Well, he knows what Nazis do to people who don't quite fit the mold. And on top of that, I would assume that that the hypnotizer, Benjamin Simon, is Jewish. So all these things are coming out from Barney's experiences. Are they false memories? Yes. Okay. I don't believe that red-headed Irishmen and Nazi officers fly around in discs over the New Hampshire mountains. But to say, oh, it's false memory syndrome, let's forget about it, I think is an enormous mistake.
Well, Eric, let me turn back to you, and because we had earlier thought that maybe the 70s weren't the hotbed of it, but maybe the late 80s where the modern UFO movement became. I want to talk about a couple of people from the 1980s who became quite famous and had best-selling books. The first one has to be Whitley Strieber in Communion, which became, sort of, I guess, almost what these vampire books are today. 30-something years ago, I think Communion sold maybe 20, 30 million books in paperback. It was later adapted into a movie. I think Christopher Walken was in it. And here's a guy who was even then a well-known horror writer, a fantasy writer. Wolfen, I think, was his most famous work before that. What was the impact of Communion? It seems that Strieber has gone back and forth over the years of whether he believes in it or not. Is he a charlatan? Was he just out to make money? What is your idea? Let me start with Eric first about Strieber, and then we'll move on, and then I'll ask David about Strieber. But what's your idea about Whitley Strieber and the Communion phenomenon?
It's a good question. Whitney is a character of his own. First of all, it's important to remember. I think Whitney is an excellent, very outstanding storyteller. So he can bring a lot of his own personal feelings and get people to appreciate them for what they are, which makes his books very powerful that way. So he has a way to convince people that is very powerful. Whitney, I met him and discussed with him, and he always makes clear that although he has his own explanation, he's not sure what's the truth behind all this. And we have to give it to him. He's being very honest that way. He doesn't know, and he doesn't claim to know. He has a perfect explanation, but that's it. But I think it's his capacity to tell stories, and I'm not saying he's lying, but it's just that the way he's so good at telling stories, a lot of people can absorb those stories, mix up those stories with their own stories and their own feelings or stories they've heard, and it had a snowball effect again of a different kind through books, where the story of the abduction, the story of the Greys, the other kinds of aliens became part of the popular culture. So he's very effective that way. Did he have any intent into creating that world? Probably not. I don't see him having ill intention. He's just a very successful and very effective writer. So, and he succeeded in get his stories known. I don't see a fraud that way. I think he's sincere in the things he says. I know certain things he said. He knows for a fact that they are dream-like events, and there's no actual reality to it. And maybe sometimes it's not very clear that which one is which, but overall, he's very sincere.
What is your take on Whitley Strieber, David?
I absolutely agree with Eric. I think I would absolutely rule out the idea that he's a charlatan, that he's in it to make money. I think he had some very strange experiences, which he himself did not understand, and he never said that they were space beings. Mm-hmm. All he said is, these are experiences I've had that baffle me and that have transformed my life. Mm-hmm. Jeffrey Kripal, whom I referred to earlier, the Rice University professor, co-authored a magnificent book with Strieber that came out about a year ago called The Supernatural. What Kreipal has said is that if what Whitley Strieber describes is not erotic religious mysticism, I do not know what it is. And I think he is absolutely right. I think that although he is indeed a very gifted storyteller, I think the book's impact was not due to its content, which I have very great difficulty remembering from time to time, but its cut, which gave us, it was painted by artist named Ed Jacobs on Strieber's guidance, and it is what gave us our current picture of UFO alien.
Yeah, it's the archetype.
Sorry?
It's the archetype.
Yes. Before January 1987, the communion emerges, and we can divide the history of the alien image into pre-Strieber, pre-communion, post-communion.
Yeah.
Now, may I say one other thing on
Sure.
that alien image? That some UFO writers have compared it to a prehistoric mask discovered in Kosovo and set the two side by side. It's the Predionica mask, and if you Google it, you can easily see it. I believe those resemblances are absolutely legitimate. Not that aliens landed in prehistoric Kosovo, but that either Ted Jacobs, who was a French-trained artist and presumably had a wide knowledge of the history of art, had seen that Predionica mask and used it to depict what Strieber was telling him, or else it was something that came from our collective unconscious. Either way, it resonated to our collective unconscious. There are, Strieber received something like 500,000 letters from people, many of whom saw that cover and said, that happened to me.
Yeah. And it should be said that as well, the communion books and the later books, I think really re-kick-started the Man in Black phenomenon too, because not only did we get the gray bug-eyed aliens, but it seems to me, and I'm not an expert, maybe I'm wrong, that the idea of government agents, while that went back to the 50s, again, it was Strieber who put that on the modern map that Hollywood took over.
Not that I know of. Eric, am I mistaken here? I don't remember that he even mentions Men in Black.
Well, that there were, like, no, he didn't. Okay, maybe I'm mixing him up. Let me move on to some other famous or some infamous people within the UFO community, because I think it's important to give a sense, historically speaking. And I want to go on to the guy who, after Strieber, is probably most identified with modern abductionism, and that's Bud Hopkins. And while I can't out and out say that I think Hopkins was a fraud necessarily, I think he did a lot of damage to the credibility of it, because I know when I was a kid I had what might be called some paranormal kind of phenomenon. I don't think anything really otherworldly happened. I think children especially have these kinds of intuitions, and they see things and they hear things and they put things together, a poltergeist, that kind of thing. But when I read the book Missing Time, which was another sort of landmark book that came out, I think, right in the wake of Communion, or maybe it actually preceded Communion by a year or so, I remember I wrote to him and talked about these incidents of mine, which had nothing to do with classic UFOs, but were very similar. And it seems to me Hopkins easily, and I've met some people too over the years who said that they've had a similar experience and they had written to Hopkins. Hopkins filtered out a lot of the things that he didn't think matched his idea of missing time and abduction to paint this portrait of the modern UFO phenomenon, rather than this idea of missing time as culturally important within a wider array of human experiences. Let me start with David and then go to Eric this time. What do you think about Bud Hopkins? Because it seems to me that, especially with things about his claiming about a woman being taken out of a building seen by many in New York City, or I think he has a story about the head of the UN at one point claiming to have seen an abduction and whatnot. It seems to me that he was sort of a modern Barnum.
Yeah, I don't know what to tell you about Hopkins. His ex-wife Carol, and we should say the late Bud Hopkins.
Yeah.
That he passed away about 5-6 years ago. That his ex-wife Carol Rainey published what seemed to me who co-authored one of the books, published on the web what seemed to me some quite damning recollections of Hopkins' credulity and his thirst for an ever more dramatic story. On the other hand, I must say that Jerry Clark knew him personally, the author of the UFO Encyclopedia, and Jerry Clark swears by him, and I swear by Jerry Clark. This man, this is a man absolutely. Jerry is a man of absolutely towering intellect and of deep honesty. And if he respected Bud Hopkins, I've got to say, there's something to him.
Well, the thing, though, is I don't know if you've read Bud Hopkins' autobiography. I've got it somewhere here. It seems to me that from the very early on, Bud Hopkins had a desire to be famous, whether it was in the art world or whatnot. So if you read his autobiography, I think it's an almost unconscious portrayal of his own desires. But what is your take, Eric, on Bud Hopkins? Do you think that, unlike, say, Strieber, that Hopkins did damage to the credibility of abductionism?
Well, I would agree with David that I don't think Bud Hopkins was malicious in his writing or dishonest, but I think he was very naive. George Hansen investigated the famous story of the lady floating in the sky, allegedly observed by the Secretary General of the United Nations.
Yeah.
And clearly, Bud was told a story that was not true by people who were organizing themselves to tell that story. So he was a bit naive. I think that's one problem. But because the revelations about the plot of telling a story to Bud came after, a lot of people took that, okay, you see, abduction stories, this is all garbage. And he did damage, but by default, not by being naive, and then his naivety being revealed. But he's one author. It's not the only one. More serious research has been done on the topic, and very, very solid research. So definitely, the fact that one individual got caught in the sense of being naive, yes, it happens, and it did a lot of damage away. But it's a bit unfair on him because a lot of good research has been done as well, and this not dismissed by Bud's mistakes.
Well, let me turn to another guy who's probably often trumpeted in the mainstream press. He's also died recently, John Mack, and he's often say, well, this Pulitzer Prize winner who wrote a bio of T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, and whenever you win a big award, you can basically go on, Nightline or whatnot and talk about anything you want. But John Mack seemed to be very sincere in his belief in this Jungian. Well, he believed in the reality of what I think David would probably call this Jungian approach to UFOs and abductionism and whatnot. What are your thoughts? I'll start with Eric and then go back to David. What are your thoughts about John Mack? Do you think that he was naive? Do you think that he might have done some damage, to the credibility of UFO lore or ufology? How about you, Eric? What's your thoughts on John Mack?
Well, I think, the problem is that when you write for a general public, the standards of how you write is different. And John was writing for the general public mostly, and but the academic research that was done behind the MIT conference, for instance, there's a lot of good stuff. And he echoes some of it, but not all of it. So it's kind of a mixed bag here. I'm not really a specialist of John Mack. I don't see him. I mean, he played an important role in the sense of establishing some ideas, whether we agree with ideas or not. But beyond that, there's not much I can say about him. I don't know, David, do you have more to it? Or?
David, what are your thoughts on John Mack and his work?
I would call him an intellectual and spiritual giant. I think the accident that took his life in 2004 was an unspeakable tragedy. I think he had a number of blind spots and vulnerable points. And I think that the most striking of them was his wish to, I'll use a Jungian term here, to unify the arts, to integrate and to reconcile both intellectually and politically that which we assume must be widely separated. And that led him to make some extremely foolish mistakes. That he was publicly humiliated by supposedly she's a writer, although I've never heard of her in any other context, who pretended to be a UFO abductee and told about how, as part of her abduction, she was she saw Kennedy and Khrushchev during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, and somehow they were reconciling, and were they hugged or something like that. And she said that when she told that preposterous story, that Mac became so excited he jumped out of his chair, and people's response is, "Ha ha ha! God must be a real loser." I think she zeroed in on the vulnerable point of a genius and used it to humiliate him. So I immensely respect his work. I immensely respect his attempt to go in a very different direction from Bud Hopkins and not see the abduction phenomenon as a threat, but as a spiritual opening for humanity. I do think it led him into some very bad judgments.
Yeah, it seemed that Mac, there's this idea by some people that UFOs are a born new religion for some people, that this is a third millennium birth of a new religion. I don't know if I go that far, but I wanted to talk about a few other people these people that we met, I mentioned Strieber and Hopkins and Mack, even if they may have been wrong about things, they seem to not have been purposely malicious. I want to talk about a few people and some things that seem to have been willfully put out there. Some people would argue as disinformation agents, for example. I mean, you could go back all the way to people like Donald Kehoe, who was mentioned or whatnot. But I talked about the contactee era of the 1950s, and I remember back about 30 years ago in the mid-'80s, probably the most famous contactee of all after that era was this Swiss guy named Billy Meyer, Edward Billy Meyer. And he, again, had these fanciful stories of, I think, flying to Pluto. He had these photos. I mean, I read years ago a 500, 600-page paperback book of his supposed life and adventures in outer space and whatnot. He seems to have been a deliberate charlatan. Let me start with you, David. Do you think that there was anything culturally to Billy Meyer, or is he a guy just out for the money?
I have to say I know little or nothing about Billy Meyer.
Okay.
I suppose I've mentally written him off as a charlatan, and therefore not explored him at all.
Eric, do you have any ideas about, or do you know of the Billy Meyer claims?
Well, it appears to me as a charlatan. I mean, his claims have been investigated thoroughly by a number of people, and they found so many holes that, there's not much left. We can give another example. This French gentleman, Vorillon, who became the leader of a sect, mostly based in Quebec and in France. Maybe these people had an experience very intense, but after that, they decided to become entrepreneurs and make the most out of the experience. So yes, this happens. It happens in any field, actually. But Myers seems to be, to me, anyway, one of those. Although he was probably not as sophisticated as Vorion in later years, but definitely have entrepreneurs here.
Well, now a fellow who has definitely been called a government plant and whatnot. I think it was in the early or mid '90s. A fellow named Bob Lazar came forth, claimed to have worked for for the government as a subcontractor or something in Area 51 or the Groom Lake area, where he claims that they were backwards engineering these UFOs, these flying ships, that he had that I think early '90s thing about the alien autopsy, that he had seen these aliens. Some may have been alive, some may have come from Roswell or other crashes in Pennsylvania or whatnot. This goes back, obviously, this was right around the time when the X-Files was on. I mean, this guy could have been an X-Files character, basically, with all his claims. Let me start with you, Eric, and then go to David. What is your take on Bob Lazar? Was Bob Lazar a nut job? He seems a little bit more credible than Billy Meyer. Was he a publicity seeker, or did he see something? Do you think that the government screwed him over? What is the story there, do you think?
Well, his story to me is totally incredible and not believable. I mean, I work with people in the Air Force research laboratories. I know how they think, how they work. I know how classification works. All the things doesn't make any sense at all. And then that's, if you add to it, all the research was done by some ufologists, try to find where he allegedly studied and where he allegedly worked. And there's not much to it. So it seems to me that someone's tried to get some fame for some personal reason. Not necessarily money, it could be just a psychological need. But there's not much to the story. The words I've mentioned, really, I'm not impressed.
Okay. How about you, David? Do you take anything that Bob Lazar claimed about alien autopsies or this Area 51 stuff? Do you think anything of it?
Well, given my approach to UFOs, I think I have, almost by definition, I have to say, I think it's false.
Uh-huh.
Now, how he came to it, and whether he was deliberately lying or believed it himself, I don't know, and I think it would be an extremely interesting area to explore. I just don't know.
I know some years ago my wife and I were in Carlsbad, New Mexico, and one of the days we drove up to Roswell, and I saw the Roswell Museum back then. I think it's moved to a different spot, but that whole town, it seems to be just very cheesy. I remember across the street from the museum there was this UFO shop or whatnot. We're walking through, and they had for like $2 you can have the UFO experience. So I said to my wife, let's go see this. So we went in, and they had these like little murals with these hanging little figurines from strings. And I accidentally walked into one of the walls. I thought I was going to knock the whole thing down. Do you think that like towns like Roswell that trying to make money off this supposed event from 70 odd years ago, do you think that helps or hurts, or is it just harmless fun? Either one of you. I'll start with you, David. Go ahead.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think first of all, I'm not sure that the word "help" or "hurt" that it's even relevant. I mean, I don't think it either increases or decreases the plausibility of being spaceships, which, in my opinion, is just quite like zero anyway. Certainly, it's harmless fun. I don't think it harms anybody, and it certainly does good for the Roswell economy. Now, I have a Google alert out for UFO, and one thing that is striking me is that UFO festivals are springing up everywhere. That chambers of commerce just love them. That there are parades, there are speakers. Some of them are quite serious ufologists. So. And it's a new phenomenon. I mean, when I was a kid, it would have been absolutely unthinkable. So what's going on here? How seriously do the people who go to these these UFO festivals believe.
Mm-hmm.
I think in some ways, what ufology involves is a clarification of what belief means. When I was 15 years old, I believed that UFOs were either extraterrestrial, hostile. Now, if we are being visited by super developed aliens with hostile intents, surely that's a horrific image of the future. Yet I know for a fact that I was not 1/100th as afraid of the looming alien invasion as I was afraid that if I ever got up the nerve to ask a girl out on a date, she would say, "Me go out with you," and spread it all over the school. Now, what is that belief? You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Is that a real belief or is it not?
Mm.
Similarly, when people go to the dress up as green aliens, which by the way is almost never reported, the green alien is almost totally
well, wasn't that started with the character on the Flintstones, the Great Gazoo or something? You know,
it goes back. The greenness of UFO aliens goes back in one form or another to the beginning of the UFO era. Though apparently little green men did not become a phrase until 1955. Okay. But this is something which the brilliant Martin Kottmeyer has analyzed, I think, very well, which is, if nobody ever sees green aliens, why are all aliens supposed to be green?
Yeah.
And which to me is an incredibly important question. I don't have that anyway. If somebody dressed, that's a side thing. But if I go to Roswell and I dress up as a green alien, or I put on a tinfoil hat and march down the street and use the occasion to try to pick up young ladies, does that mean I don't genuinely believe we are being visited by UFOs? I don't think so. But what is the texture of my belief?
Eric, any thoughts about sort of the marketing of the Roswell incident kind of thing? Do you think it's just harmless, basic fun? And then I want to turn towards now the internet in the 21st century age, but let me just end here with Roswell.
All right, I'll do a risky analogy here, but I see a lot of commonalities. If you think about areas where there's been Marian aversions, usually you have a lot of shops that sells religious-related stuff, books, statues of the Virgin Mary, etc.
Well, the 1917 Our Lady of Fatima incident or something.
Yes, that's one of them. The one in former Yugoslavia. There's many places. There's one near Quebec City where I live.
Yeah.
I used to live anyway. So there is a tourism, religious tourism, and it's not a crime, and religious authorities have nothing against that. This does not prevent research done in theology and religious studies departments on Marian aversion. Some are taking a approach more like David, psychosocial, psychoanalytical. Others are taking a more believer's approach, writing about this. You know, the fact that there's a cultural / economic aspect to a phenomenon does not prevent research to be done seriously or not seriously. I think these are separate things. I think what you're trying to allude to is that ufology is kind of a dual purpose phenomenon. Yes, there are some people doing research about UFOs, usually pursuing the extraterrestrial hypothesis, most of them, on one hand, but at the same time, ufology is also a cultural thing. People publish books and try to spread a story about, UFOs. So there's the dual dimension of cultural education and some research as well. And I think it's always true for when you have a phenomenon that interests the population in general. I mean, David's research is outstanding, but how many people actually have this view? Or my research for the military, when I'm looking at details of warfare, except to experts in the field, not many people are interested. So there's no cultural aspect to it, because I don't larger population or the larger public. So that kind of research does not have that dual role of cultural communication and more academic research. So it appears serious, but it's just because it's the way it's set up.
Well, I want to turn to the 21st century and the internet era here, and things that have been in the last 15 or so years as we sort of get towards the future and wrap up the show here. But I do want to pick up on one thing before I go there, and that is what seems to be a lot of ufology and ufologists being driven by their own agendas or ideologies, and groups being at loggerheads. And I'll give you two examples. I mentioned Bud Hopkins, and I think he certainly had his own agenda. I don't know whether it was political, whether it was personal, or whatnot. And for example, one of the first people I contacted to do this show was a fellow named Stanton Friedman, and he seems to be one of these hard ufologists. He thinks they are metallic ships that come from afar and whatnot. And I think it might have been David Halperin that he didn't want to appear on a show with David Halperin, him and this other one, because David is, I guess, a skeptic within the UFO universe. To what degree do you think that people with agendas, be they someone Stanton Friedman, who may see himself as more science-driven, versus Bud Hopkins, who whatever agenda he may have had, do these agendas, do they detract does that put ufologists and the study of this phenomenon at loggerheads, and does it hamper things? Let me start with you, David.
Well, I think agendas are part of, as human beings, we all have agendas. I spent many years in academia, and it seems to me that people in Judaic studies or religious studies are just as agenda-driven as any ufologist, and capable of being just as petty about it as ufologists. Yeah, it would be nice if we could set aside our agendas and work together. I would have valued the opportunity to share a platform with Stanton Friedman, and that from our differences, something like truth might have emerged. But I mean, we're all human.
Eric, what's your take on? Do you think that there are is ufology sometimes agenda-driven, and is that a negative?
Well, ufology is a world of believers. People believe that they're aliens, or they believe there's nothing. And for me, the debunkers are believers. It's just they believe there's nothing. And so people having different beliefs will talk to each other, but unless they share the same belief, what they're saying will just pass to each other, because it's not based on an attempt to be reasonable. Because a dialogue or research, to be reasonable, means that I accept in advance I could be wrong. And I think I like David. David is more on the skeptical side, but he's open to explain things different ways. And same thing, I accept that it could be completely wrong, in the end, and that's fine. I don't have that agenda of proving my belief. My agenda is try to bring some reason in the debates. Yeah. But very, very few people in ufology is trying to do that. They just try to defend their beliefs, either aliens or time travelers, or that there's nothing to it. That's their belief.
Well, now I'll be posting this video of our discussion on YouTube and Vimeo, and in this age of lowest common denominator, one of the ironies I find is that even though there's more quote-unquote opportunity to video stuff with cell phones and whatnot, it seems to have had the negative effect on psi phenomenon in making it that anytime we see Bigfoots or UFOs or lights in the skies or the Virgin Mary or lake monsters or whatnot, and there's a supposed video, it's either so obviously a fraud, or if it's good enough or whatnot, well, we now know that we have rather cheap things online that we can make things look real. So the odd thing is that even though we have far more equipment and more people have cameras and whatnot, it's almost worthless, evidentially speaking. You know, if we were to bring this before a jury, I'll give you an example. I saw last year this fellow who's a Bigfoot believer, and he does these rationalizations for obviously fake Bigfoot videos. One of them, I used to be a delivery driver, and when you're backing up a truck, we now have computer screens where you can see a divide, like two lines and then a broken lines in the middle. That's the width of the truck. And there's a video of a Bigfoot running at this couple supposedly in Canada, and the guy thinks that dividing line there, he doesn't realize it's generated by the computer. It's not on the actual road. So he's saying, well, this is obviously a 12 or 14-foot Bigfoot. Well, no, it's obviously a regular-sized human. So when I see things like the Phoenix Lights videos, or I see things, like that, I'm just so jaded that, it's so easily replicable. What do you think about the irony? And I'll start with Eric and then go to David. Has technology made these claims of UFOs and whatnot almost impossible to prove now?
Not really. The problem of photographic and video evidence is a very old one. You think about pictures of the 1950s, they were analyzed, and sometimes you cannot. The best you could say, the best evidence, quote unquote, is inconclusive.
But there were photos when we could obviously see pie plates and a little string. Now with Photoshop, even if we have a string, we can wipe it out.
No, of course, this is more difficult today to prove a false. But the argument I'm trying to make here is that all this should be called artifact, because it's always based on who did that at what time, and we have to believe the person that said, I took that picture at that time, that place, and so on. And that is not proof in a hard physical sense, because it always comes with who took that proof. And in that person, the context, are they looking for money, and that aspect is still there, even if it's worse today, because yes, you can Photoshop, it's easy to trick. But even in the past, the photographics evidence was never good evidence because of this artifact nature of photographic or video evidence. It hasn't changed, just worse than it was.
How about you, David? What are your thoughts about modern technology and fakery with video stuff?
Yeah, well, I mean, you know that it's now a common skeptical argument, which I find personally quite convincing, that with people basically carrying cameras around with them every minute of the day, now it's odd that we don't have any decent photos of UFOs, but you raised the really interesting question: if we did have a decent photo of a UFO, how would we know it was real? And I think the only way it could be that really there would have to be an accumulation of photographs by different people who seem to be trustworthy, and perhaps that the photographs showed things that we would never expect in a UFO. I mean, some time ago that somebody, that a inscription was found on some piece, sort of the equivalent of a coffin coming from Israel, which wrote in perfect Aramaic, James, the son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. Now, was this authentic? I could see no reason to doubt its authenticity except one. It turns out it was a fake. But I could see no reason to doubt its authenticity except one, which is that it so perfectly corresponds to what we would expect.
Yeah.
If it had said, James, the son of, the lion-headed brother of Jesus, I would think maybe it would have some possibility. You see what I mean? Something that would, that seems, because the reality never suits our expectations.
Well, isn't that like with Star Trek and Star Wars? Why do all the aliens tend to look humanoid? If they were truly alien and they were raised on planet or grew up on planets with different atmospheric pressures, different light, different senses, they would be truly alien. They wouldn't just have Mr. Spock's ears or a different color or something.
Yeah, that's why I think that Spielberg made a huge mistake in showing the aliens in Close Encounters
Yeah.
of the Third Kind. But on the other hand, it grossed multi-million dollars, so maybe he didn't make a mistake. And if he'd done it the way I would have wanted him to do it, it would have flopped. So I just don't know.
Well, I want to get, though, one of the things with UFOs is it's unidentified flying objects. So obviously the UFOs exist. If someone asks it, there are many objects that are unidentified. Probably for me in the last 10 years or so, there was this silly notion from people thinking that there were these things called rods that flew around in the Earth's atmosphere. And it turned out to just be bugs, little insects that move too fast for even the quickest cameras to snap. And people are, oh, there's this new kind of thing. What are these little rods that are floating around the atmosphere? And to me, it just looked like smudges on there. And yet people believe this stuff. So it seems to me that there is this will to believe. There is this simian gullibility or desire to believe in something more than that we're just a bunch of banana-eating simians that came down from the trees. Do you think that's at the root of it, David?
I wouldn't put it quite so negatively.
Okay.
I mean, there's a classic book by Jung. Was one of the last writings he published before his death, 1959. Flying Saucers: A Modern Myth, Things Seen in the Skies. And to Jung, to be a myth was not a disparaging term. It was actually a term of high honor. That a myth is a collective dream that's coming from inside us, bearing a wisdom that consciously we don't have. So I would say, yeah, that the UFOs are myths. They are coming from inside us. But it's not just, well, we want to believe, so we'll believe. It's that they're telling us things that we may not be able to understand or absorb. In which sense, I think the UFOs are real. I think in the controversy between the UFOs and the ufologists and the debunkers, I'm on the side of the ufologists. The debunkers are right about the less significant information. UFOs do not exist. The ufologists are right about the more significant thing. UFOs are of absolutely crucial importance.
I want to end a final segment and give you both a chance to just talk a little bit about your final thoughts, and we'll talk maybe about David's book for a moment, his latest novel. But let me just wrap things up here in the main segment before we end up. You mentioned Jung a couple of times, and I wanted to mention one fellow who I think wrote what I would consider a seminal book, because we mentioned a lot of names, and I think it was David who mentioned Jacques Vallée early in the show. And Vallée wrote a book, 20, 30, maybe it's the late 60s even, Passport to Magonia, that I think is a very overlooked book. And I think it tries to forge sort of a union of all of these belief systems, whether it's UFOs or Bigfoot, whether it's the Frogman of Loveland or Texas or whatnot, and put it in what I would consider the camp that David Halperin is I guess, occupying, in that there is a deeper reality. It may not be an objective physical reality, but it's the reality of the mind that human beings create and what we're projecting into the world as needs. Let me start with Eric this time, and then David. Do you think that Vallée is onto something, and what do you think is the impact or significant? Because to me, I think Passport to Magonia in 50 or 100 years, he's not going to be seen like an Ignatius Donnelly or Emmanuel Velikovsky. I think that book will be looked at with deeper psychological, scientific eyes in 100 years. What's your thought on Vallée and his work, Eric?
Oh, definitely Vallée is a pioneer of looking at UFOs differently. At the time he wrote Passport to Magonia, was one of the very few who was pushing that kind of interpretation and look at the UFO. One thing though about Jacques is I think he sees that there is some sort of external force involved that is probably not human, but not alien in the normal sense of the word. But there's something outside us that is acting. And that's probably one of the main difference between people like David and myself, where we tend to say that that external force is not there. It is us that projecting ourselves in one way or another out there and talking to ourselves. David and I are just disagreeing on some of the mechanism of how it's done, but essentially we're in the same view. So, yeah, Jacques Vallée definitely opened the door to different explanations, and his approach to with Begonia helps actually show that the UFO phenomenon, the mechanism that's behind it, is actually about can be applied to a lot of other things, and a lot of the phenomena reported probably can be explained through the same fundamental mechanism. It's not unique to UFO. So that I think is very strong, but I personally disagree with Vallée that there's this external force out there somehow acting. That I disagree with him.
When you say external, is that more in the religious sense? Because when we talk about supernatural things, I've always found it odd that people who believe in God, devoutly religious people, will scoff and say, well, there can't be an hairy ape man walking around the northwest U.S. There can't be UFOs. Well, I'm like, well, if you believe in a creature, a being that can create everything, as far out as that is, you can't believe that there could be a band of hairy apes in the northwest U.S.? I mean, I don't believe that there are Bigfoots, but it seems almost infinitely more likely that there could be some Bigfoots than there could be a being that created everything. So I've never really understood that. Are you saying that you think Vallée is looking more religiously for that other?
I would not use the word religious because I don't think it's just a take it takes.
Okay.
He's looking more at some sort of entity, but an entity that is not a god, but is very diffuse and unexplained, but external to human.
Okay.
Somehow talk to us at some points here and there.
Okay.
So it's not very clear what it is.
Okay. David, what are your thoughts on Passport to Magonia and Vallée?
I think it's a brilliant book. I think that Eric has very well stated the difference between Jacques' position and the one that Eric and I share. I think it's regrettable. I mean, when Passport to Magonia came out, I think many of us had the sense this was a pioneering work. The problem is no one seemed to know quite how to follow it. One who did was none other than my own Jerry Clark, who I have to say, when he was 16 and I was 15, we exchanged 20-page letters when he bought UFOs, which is the reason why I'm so gung-ho for him. But he and Lauren Coleman published a book called The Unidentified, which he has since disavowed as naive and phenomenally silly, but which I think was a darn good piece of work that followed up some of Vallée's ideas in a very fun way. I will give a bit of speculation here. And I've been speculating for the past hour and a half. So what else is new? That Freud pioneered the individual unconscious. Jung completely accepted Freud's unconscious, but posited a deeper and broader unconscious that incorporated Freudian unconscious.
Yeah.
What if there's a third unconscious that is as much larger than the Jungian unconscious as Jung's is to Freud's? If there is such a thing, that might be the essence of where the UFOs come from, and if there is a distinction between that and God, I am not sure what it is.
Well,
so the UFOs are profoundly religious.
Well, I want to end this segment and then just do a final segment where you wrap up. But I just wanted to follow up. You said something, David, about Jerome Clark disavowing an earlier work. Was that because he looked at that book as sort of like Charles Fort's Low, that Ripley Believe It's or Not kind of? Was it too out there, or did he get any information that some of the things were hoaxes that he had written about?
He stumbled up against what's called Close Encounters of the Second Kind. Where UFOs leave physical traces. and he could not explain how psychic phenomena could leave physical traces. And if you ask me, I can't explain it either. Okay, but I still think UFOs are something psychic.
Okay.
There's just that part I can't put. So Jerry took a total 180-degree turn and went back to the extraterrestrial visitor hypothesis.
Okay.
I think he's wrong, but you can learn from Jerry what he's wrong, what you can learn from most people when they're right.
All right, well, let's end this segment. In the final segment, I'll give both Eric and David a final say-so, and we'll do that in a moment. I have spent the last couple of hours talking with David Halperin and Eric Wellett about basically the totality of the UFO phenomenon from way back until right now. And we've covered a lot of territory, and probably there's a dozen or so shows I could do of the same length on any of those individual things that we've talked about, but this is sort of just a primer. So let me end and give you both a final say. So I will link to both of your websites, both Eric's and David's websites below this video for anyone who wants more information. Eric, where do you see the future of ufology going? Do you think it's going to get more nuts and bolts as we head towards the middle 21st century, that the idea that these are, as we get out to Mars, I'm surely we're probably going to see some odd things around Phobos and Deimos. Is this going to make us more prone to thinking that, they're spying on us? What's your idea of the future?
Well, predicting the future is a very risky thing, so but I'll take the risk. I essentially think that UFO phenomena in general are actually a projection of ourselves. I think that there's sometimes a parapsychological elements to it, but they will take different forms and shape as our collective worries, our collective issues, our collective challenges will change. So the phenomenon will change accordingly, and it's very hard to predict how it will change. In terms of ufology, what I see right now, and I hope that things will change, but there's I think a general decline in interest of the topic to be studied seriously. There's less people doing it. There is a hardcore of extraterrestrial believers and conspiracy theorists that became hardened, and will kind of there's no way to have communications with people like that. They are so entrenched in the belief system. But unfortunately, thank goodness we have people like David. Some of the researchers that are emerging in the so-called psychosocial perspective on UFOs, they look a lot like the blind debunkers of the 1950s, or they're very disrespectful of witnesses. That's what I see right now emerging, and that's kind of a bit saddening me. I'm glad we have people like David and other people he mentioned, Dave Rifle and Ahsoka and others. But I would say that the ufology that's looked done in a way that is sincere, serious, but open to challenge. There's a very small quantity of people actually doing it. That's my perspective. I hope that small quantity will grow and get bigger, but it's more hope than prediction for the future. So that's kind of how I see it.
Before I go on to David, let me just ask you, do you think that this decline in UFO interest might be to the fact that young people are taking selfies all the time? They're documenting I just went to the bathroom at a Baskin Robbins, I posted on Facebook or whatnot. Do you think that instead of looking out, people have turned so deeply inward right now culturally that unless we can prove it, unless we can hold it, touch it, Snapchat it in 5 seconds, it doesn't matter to a lot of people? Do you think that's part of the reason that UFO interest has declined?
I think there's two main reasons. One is ufologists themselves. All the delirium that happened with Roswell was so much discredit to the whole idea in the general public that there's been a decline. People said, poof, what the hell is this? So that's one thing. But two, and that's maybe more the sociologist speaking here, but there's more fragmentation in our society in terms of interest, in terms of groups, in terms of communities. And if we say that the UFO phenomenon is actually projections of us, the collective us, and we're more fragmented, then there's less possibilities of a more larger, unified phenomena to emerge because we're ourselves more fragmented. So you will have more fragmented projections of ourselves that will take many different shapes locally.
Okay. Well, David, let me end with you. Before I ask you your thoughts of the future of ufology, I note that you had written a novel. Is it really a novel called about your life, or is it really a closet memoir?
Well, it's called Journal of the UFO Investigator, and when asked whether it's autobiographical, I usually answer that the car chases, the intergalactic sex, and the descent into the netherworld are all autobiographical. Other parts, however, I made up. And I think we could say that for many novels. It certainly rests on my, not so much on my life as a teenage ufologist, but on dreams and fantasies that I had as a teenage ufologist.
Well, let me ask the same thing I asked about Eric. Where do you see, the rest of maybe the mid-century? Do you think ufology is going to wane a bit more? Eric thinks it's on the wane, the study of UFOs, or do you think, there's going to be something that kicks it back up?
Well, first of all, I hope that we will have many more studies like Eric's Illuminations, which is a book that came out, I think, about a year ago, right?
2 years ago, yeah.
2 years ago, which has just some brilliant analyses, particularly of the 1989 to 1990 Belgian wave, and I'm hoping we'll see more books like that and writings like Jeff Kripal's and Diana Pasuka's. I have no idea. Otherwise, I have no idea. If you asked me in the mid-'60s, I could never have predicted the rise of the abduction phenomenon. I could never have predicted that Roswell would become. I would never heard of Roswell to begin with, but if you told me what it was, I would never have predicted that it would become the single best known UFO story that I think has permanently entered the cultural consciousness. And I'm not so sure that UFO interest at the moment is declining. It may just be taking different forms. I think that the proliferation of UFO festivals, local UFO festivals, is a new way in which it expresses itself. So let's just say the phenomenon will continue to astound us.
Well, when you say UFO festivals, do you think there seems to be a history of sort of the domestication of the wild myths of yore? The cowboys have been domesticated. The gangsters of the 20s and 30s have become these kind of mythic, Al Capone was a dog-faced, rotten-ass killer, but Al Capone in myth is this cool kind of guy. Jesse James was a racist son of a bitch, but Jesse James of the movies is cool. Do you think that the UFO lore is somehow being domesticated, perhaps?
I don't know.
Okay.
Consider the Men in Black movies.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a tradition that goes back to the 50s, yet it doesn't become Hollywood until the 90s. I don't know.
Okay. Well, let's leave it at that then. That's an apt ending. I want to thank Eric Wellett and David Halpern for spending a couple of hours talking in depth about it. And I will link to both your websites, so thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.